Since we've looked at how to create HTML pages and to modify their appearance, we should talk for a few moments about how do these pages get to people? How do you put your files out into production so that somebody can actually see them on the internet? The files that you create are hosted. That means they're placed on a server that's connected to the internet. That machine is called a server, and a particular type is called a web server. The web server serves up content based on requests from the internet. Those requests come from multiple sources, but the example that we're most familiar with are people visiting websites, clicking on links, browsing to pages, looking at content. The purpose of the web server is to serve up the HTML page and all the elements that constitute your HTML page from the web server to the requestor's web browser. You have made these requests every time you visited anybody's web page. Every time you clicked on a link, clicked on an image, or entered a new website address. You might be wondering, what's your role as a web page maker writing HTML and getting it ready to publish out to the world? Typically, a website designer is not also the webmaster. The website designer typically has responsibility for the web page content, but not the maintenance of the web server itself. The webmaster typically has the responsibility for ensuring the web server is up and running 24/7. In a corporate setting, the webmaster would likely be an individual in your IT department. In a personal setting, the webmaster might be your hosting provider, where you have your website housed. Well, how does the web server actually serve up those pages? Let's take a look at what's going on. The web server receives requests anytime anybody types in a website address, such as totaltraining.com. That website address is also referred to as a URL. URL stands for Universal Resource Locator, essentially a long-winded description of a website address. When someone enters a website address into the URL field in their web browser, the web server interprets that request, locates the appropriate file, as defined by the HTML that you create, on the web server, and sends that file to the requester's web browser via Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP. You could think of HTTP as the formatting, the packaging of the data as it's packaged up and sent out over the internet, much like anything that you've ever sent before in an envelope, had to be addressed, a stamp affixed to it, put out into communication, and delivered to a destination. HTTP is the format in which the data that constitutes your web pages, your website, is packaged and sent over the internet. Next time you go to a web browser and type in a website address, look before the www after you hit return when entering a website address. You'll typically see the HTTP protocol appended as a prefix before the website address you typed. In corporate settings, you'll normally not have direct access to a production web server. If you're maintaining your own personal website for yourself or your own small business, typically you will. But when you work with corporate entities, you'll typically see a web server scenario that's staggered, where you will develop locally, building HTML files and perhaps testing them on a web server that's resident on your own computer. You will then publish those updates to what's referred to as a staging web server, which is essentially a copy of the web server on a different machine, available on the internet, but not to the general public, usually behind a corporate firewall. It's essentially a testing ground. Staging servers are also often referred to as sandboxes, based on the metaphor of children playing in a sandbox. You can do anything you want inside the sandbox, make your HTML pages, discover where the errors are, correct them, before the pages are published to the general public. Lastly, when you've tested your web pages on a staging environment, then corporate IT departments will publish those changes from a staging web server to a live production web server that actually hosts the production website. In a corporate setting, this is the ideal configuration, and you essentially do not want the responsibility that the webmaster has. Anything that you have access to is something that you can break. There are many versions of web servers for different platforms. Two common web server technologies that you'll encounter will be Apache and Internet Information Server. For our purposes in this class, we're not going to use a web server technology. You do not need a web server running on your computer. We are going to create what is referred to as static HTML. That is, HTML tags which are read and not interpreted by the web browser to be anything other than what you create them as.